A celebrated beauty once commanded every ballroom, then chose to vanish forever. She possessed staggering wealth, breathtaking beauty, and a place at the very pinnacle of Gilded Age society. Yet she turned her back on it all for a life of absolute seclusion. By the end of her story, you will understand the shocking truth behind one of history's most extreme transformations from socialite to hermit. What hidden torment could make a woman abandon a life of luxury for the silence of four walls? And what secrets did her locked rooms ultimately reveal? What does it truly take to walk away from everything you are supposed to want? The gaslight of 1,000 crystal chandeliers shimmered across a sea of silk and diamonds. On a night like this, in a Fifth Avenue mansion overflowing with New York's most elite families, a young woman made her debut, and from the moment she descended the grand staircase, she was the only person anyone could see. Her gown was a masterpiece of ivory satin, embroidered with seed pearls that caught the light with her every graceful movement. A simple whisper of her name, a name synonymous with old money and railroad fortunes, rippled through the crowd before a wave of applause even began. This was the Gilded Age, a period where colossal industrial wealth built palatial homes and dictated rigid social codes, and her family stood firmly at its apex. They were not merely rich, they were established, their lineage and power woven into the very fabric of the city. And she, their only daughter, was their ultimate asset, the final piece in a dynastic plan generations in the making. Every smile she offered was a currency, every dance a carefully negotiated transaction. The pressure was a constant, invisible weight, as heavy as the jewels around her neck, a silent understanding that her entire worth was measured by the brilliance of her debut and the prestige of the marriage she would secure. She had been born for this single purpose, to be the flawless jewel in her family's crown, and on this triumphant night, she performed her role to perfection. Yet behind the dazzling smile and the impeccable poise, a quiet question must have lingered. Was this glittering world her destiny, or was it her gilded cage? Her face became a familiar icon in parlors across the nation. In an age before moving pictures, the title of professional beauty was reserved for women whose photographic portraits achieved mass popularity, and she was its undisputed queen. Her likeness, captured in elegant carte de visite cards and featured in society magazines, was collected, traded, and gazed upon by countless admirers. She represented the ultimate aspiration, a living embodiment of the era's ideal, where immense wealth was matched only by exquisite grace and beauty. The public hungered for every detail. What gown did she wear to the Vanderbilt ball? Which suitor was seen escorting her at the opera? Her every public move was meticulously documented and devoured by readers, transforming her from a mere socialite into a national celebrity. She was not just a person, but a symbol, a flawless image sold on paper that reinforced the glittering fantasy of the Gilded Age. Yet this constant scrutiny created a profound paradox. The very adoration that cemented her fame also built walls around her, turning her life into a performance where her own identity was slowly being consumed by the legend the public demanded her to be. How does a real person live up to a perfect image? And what happens when the woman behind the photograph begins to fracture under its weight? The immense fortune that funded her legendary beauty was built on the relentless expansion of the railroad. Her family did not simply invest in trains. They laid the tracks that stitched the continent together, amassing a wealth so vast it was almost incomprehensible. This was new money, a torrent of industrial capital that challenged the quiet, inherited fortunes of the old aristocratic families. For generations, elite status had been defined by land and lineage, but now a new kind of power was emerging, forged in steel and driven by steam. Her family stood precisely at this volatile crossroads. They possessed the financial might to buy anything, yet they lacked the social validation that only old New York could bestow. Their every move was a calculated performance, a delicate dance of building opulent mansions to showcase their wealth, while carefully studying the intricate rules of a society that still viewed them as outsiders. It was into this world of fragile prestige that she was born, and her entire existence became the key to securing her family's legacy. Her projected inheritance was not merely a number, it was a kingdom. We are talking about a sum equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's dollars, a fortune that guaranteed a life of absolute privilege. Yet this staggering wealth also acted as her anchor. It dictated her friendships, her education, her very purpose. She was not just an heiress. She was a human bond, the final and most beautiful asset her family would use to purchase the one thing their money could not instantly buy: unconditional acceptance into the inner sanctum of the old guard. The weight of that expectation, the knowledge that her personal happiness was secondary to a dynastic merger, must have made the glitter of her jewels feel terribly cold. This relentless performance was her reality, a whirlwind of obligations that left no room for a private thought. Each season was a meticulously orchestrated campaign, moving from the opera boxes of New York to the sprawling cottages of Newport, with every moment scheduled for maximum social visibility. A Monday might demand a formal ball at the Astors, a Tuesday a charity luncheon, a Wednesday a private musicale. Her calendar was not a list of pleasures, but a ledger of appearances, each one an opportunity to be seen, to be judged, and to be found flawless. Even the summer escape to Newport was not a vacation, but a different stage. There, under the guise of sea air and relaxation, the competition was just as fierce, measured by the grandeur of one's cottage, the exclusivity of one's guest list, and the elegance of one's lawn tennis costume. The primary objective was never in question. It was to secure a brilliant marriage, a union that would merge her family's formidable new wealth with a name that carried the patina of old, established lineage. She was the final, perfect piece in a grand social strategy, and her value was directly tied to her compliance and her charm. Can you hear the constant low hum of expectation that must have accompanied her, even in the most beautiful of rooms? It was a life lived under a microscope, where a single misstep, a poorly chosen word, or a moment of visible fatigue could become the subject of devastating gossip. The freedom she appeared to possess was an illusion, for every choice, from her suitors to her gowns, was filtered through the singular goal of further elevating a status that was already, to any outsider, unimaginably high. The gilded cage was not made of bars, but of invitations, and her role within it was to sing beautifully for the crowd. The line of suitors stretched from New York to Newport, a parade of power and title, all hoping to win her hand. European dukes and counts, their ancient names glittering but their family coffers often depleted, saw in her a solution to centuries of financial decay. They offered a coronet, a castle, and a place in the annals of history, all in exchange for the massive infusion of cash only an American railroad fortune could provide. Then came the American Titans, the sons of other industrial kings, whose families envisioned a merger that would create a financial dynasty of unprecedented scale. Each man was a calculated prospect, his lineage and assets weighed and measured by her family with the cold precision of bankers reviewing a ledger. The press fueled the frenzy with relentless speculation. Society columns buzzed with whispered rumors, one week confidently announcing her imminent engagement to a German prince, the next swearing she was secretly promised to the heir of a steel empire. She was not merely a young woman being courted. She was the season's ultimate prize, the object of a high-stakes auction where the currency was bloodline and the bidding was done with bouquets of flowers and boxes at the opera. Can you envision the pressure of those orchestrated encounters, every conversation, every dance, every glance analyzed not for its genuine connection, but for its strategic value? Her heart was the least considered factor in a negotiation that would determine the future of an empire. The entire world watched, placing bets on which man would finally claim the greatest trophy of the Gilded Age, never questioning if the trophy itself had a will of its own. Behind the grand public performances, a secret life unfolded in the quiet of the library. While society pages reported on her latest ball gown, she was often found curled in a deep leather chair, traveling the world through the pages of poetry and philosophy. These were not the light novels considered suitable for a young lady, but dense, challenging works by thinkers who questioned the very foundations of society, duty, and personal freedom. In the solitude of that book-lined room, she discovered a different kind of currency, one of ideas and introspection, a stark contrast to the financial transactions that governed her days. Her love for nature provided another escape. During rare, unchaperoned moments at their country estate, she would walk for hours through the woods, not to see or be seen, but simply to be. She observed the patient turning of the seasons, the self-sufficient silence of the trees, and the intricate, unobserved lives of the creatures that lived beyond the manicured lawns. This was a world that asked nothing of her, that demanded no performance and offered no judgment. These private passions were the first cracks in her gilded facade, small but profound acts of rebellion. How startling it must have been for her to realize that the deepest parts of her identity were nourished by solitude and intellectual curiosity, two things her public life was designed to systematically destroy. The conflict was set. The celebrated beauty who commanded a ballroom was, at her core, a quiet scholar and a solitary walker, a woman whose spirit yearned for a life her world could never comprehend, let alone permit. A quiet death in the family mansion fractured her world with a silence that no ballroom could ever fill. It was not a public scandal, but a profound private loss, the passing of the one person who had truly understood her secret self. For her, it was a beloved brother, a fellow traveler in a house of strangers, who shared her love of books and long, quiet walks. His sudden illness and death ripped away her only genuine confidant, the single soul who saw the woman behind the celebrated beauty. The elaborate machinery of society offered no comfort, only a new set of expectations for her grief. She was required to don black crepe, to receive formal condolences in the parlor, to perform sorrow with the same polished grace she had once performed joy. Every whispered word of sympathy felt hollow, a scripted part in a play she could no longer bear to act in. How could she possibly explain that the glittering world around her had become a mockery of her pain, that the very rituals designed to mark her loss only deepened the chasm of her isolation? This personal tragedy served as a brutal catalyst. It was as if a final, fragile tether had been cut. The loss revealed the utter emptiness of the social contract she had been raised to fulfill. What value were 1,000 admiring glances when the one person whose opinion mattered was gone forever? The performance was over. She began to decline invitations, first citing her mourning period, then offering no excuses at all. The world she had inhabited, which had always felt like a gilded cage, now felt like a tomb decorated with someone else's memories. Her withdrawal was not a sudden flight, but a slow, deliberate turning away, a quiet closing of doors that began with the one door to her own heart. The first absence was barely noticed, a missed ball attributed to a lingering cold. But as the weeks turned into months, a quiet alarm began to sound throughout the drawing rooms of New York. Where was she? The opera season commenced without her face in the family box. The summer migration to Newport occurred without her presence on the cliffs. The social calendar, that relentless engine of her former life, continued to turn, but its brightest star had quietly stepped off the stage. At first, the society pages, which had once chronicled her every appearance with breathless admiration, adopted a tone of puzzled concern. They printed gentle inquiries, wondering if the beloved beauty was perhaps traveling for her health, or recovering from a fatigue brought on by the previous season's whirlwind. Their speculation was cloaked in politeness, a reflection of the high regard in which she was still held. But politeness, in the Gilded Age, had an expiration date. As her seclusion stretched on, the whispers grew louder and less charitable. The narrative began to shift. Was it a nervous condition? Had a secret, disappointed love affair broken her spirit? The very qualities that had once been her greatest assets, her sensitivity and her thoughtful nature, were now reframed as weaknesses, potential evidence of a fragile constitution, unable to bear the weight of the world she was born to rule. Her family found themselves in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable position. They were pillars of a society built on visibility, and now they were forced to make excuses for an invisibility they could not control. They became the subject of a mixture of sympathy and subtle ridicule. Friends offered condolences for a daughter who was, for all intents and purposes, still living just upstairs. Behind closed doors, the talk was less kind. Some speculated that the family was hiding a shameful secret, perhaps a disfiguring illness or a mental instability they dared not reveal. The pressure mounted not just on her, but on the entire household, as the outside world tried to solve the mystery of the vanishing heiress. Her withdrawal was no longer a private act of grief. It had become a public scandal of absence, a silent rebellion that the world simply could not understand. The music swirled through the grand ballroom one last time. For her final public appearance, She chose a gown of dramatic black velvet, a stark and deliberate departure from the expected pastels and brilliant silks of the season. It was a gown for a woman in mourning, yet the way she wore it felt less like an expression of grief and more like a statement of intent. She moved through the crowd with a serene, almost detached grace, her famous smile replaced by a calm, enigmatic composure. Those who managed a moment of conversation found her remarks unusually philosophical. She spoke not of parties or fashions, but of the value of quietude, of how the most meaningful lives were often the ones lived away from the public gaze. To one close friend, she reportedly mused that a person could only truly find themselves once they had shed every role they were expected to play. At the time, these words were dismissed as the melancholy musings of a sensitive soul still processing a deep loss. No one understood that they were listening to her final monologue. When the clock struck a late hour, she did not make a grand exit. She simply turned and walked away from the shimmering crowd, ascending the staircase without a single backward glance. The curtain had fallen on the celebrated beauty, and she would never allow it to be raised again. The performance was over, and the woman who remained was ready to disappear into the silence she had so carefully praised. The mansion on Fifth Avenue did not empty. It simply closed its doors. Her retreat was not a flight to a foreign land or a remote cabin, but a strategic withdrawal into the fortress she already called home. The first and most decisive step was the termination of all social correspondence. The steady stream of engraved invitations and calling cards, once the lifeblood of her existence, was now intercepted by a loyal housekeeper. Letters were returned unopened, their seals intact, a silent but absolute refusal to engage. Inside, the transformation was methodical. She claimed the topmost floor of the grand house as her private domain, a world above the world. The rooms she selected were not the opulent parlors designed for entertaining, but smaller, north-facing chambers that received a calm, even light, perfect for reading and contemplation. The grand piano in the music room fell silent. The ball gowns, those exquisite costumes of her former life, were carefully packed away in trunks, the scents of perfume and cigar smoke slowly fading from their fabric. Her days took on a new and rigid rhythm, one dictated by her own desires rather than the social calendar. She rose early, often before the rest of the household was awake, to walk the enclosed garden, her footsteps the only sound on the dew-covered gravel paths. Her meals were taken in her private sitting room, served on a simple tray. She dismissed the legion of servants required for grand entertaining, retaining only a small, trusted staff who understood and respected her need for silence. They became the gatekeepers of her solitude, a human barrier between the woman she had been and the hermit she was becoming. The most telling detail of all was her treatment of the windows. The heavy velvet drapes on the street-facing side of the house were drawn shut, and over time, she had the lower halves of the window panes on her floor deliberately painted over. This was not an act of mere moodiness, but a profound and practical measure. It allowed the light to enter while completely eliminating any view of the bustling city outside, and more importantly, any chance of the outside world catching a glimpse of her. She was not just hiding from society. She was systematically erasing its very presence from her daily reality, building a sanctuary of absolute quiet within the heart of the noisy, demanding city she had once ruled. The silence she cultivated was not an emptiness, but a presence, meticulously constructed within the very walls that had once witnessed her greatest performances. Her sanctuary was not a crumbling ruin, but a pristine fortress, a hermitage engineered for absolute seclusion within a palace of marble and gilt. The grand mansion on Fifth Avenue, a symbol of Gilded Age excess, became the unlikely vessel for her radical retreat. She did not flee its opulence, she repurposed it, turning its vast spaces into a labyrinth designed to keep the world at bay. The most telling modifications were to the windows. On the upper floors where she spent her days, the lower panes of glass were systematically painted over, a stark, white barrier that allowed the diffuse northern light she loved for reading while completely obliterating any view of the city below. It was a brilliant, simple act of defiance. She could sit for hours in a pool of calm light, utterly disconnected from the bustling society whose gaze she had once commanded. The heavy velvet draperies, once drawn back to showcase the glittering life within, were now permanently closed, their thick folds absorbing sound and sight, creating a perpetual twilight. The rooms she inhabited were spare and functional, a stark contrast to the ornate public parlors downstairs. Grandiose furniture was removed, replaced by a simple bed, a sturdy writing desk, and deep, comfortable chairs positioned far from the windows. The walls, once hung with society portraits, were now lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, their spines containing the only company she truly desired. Every object in her space served a purpose, either for practical need or for the nourishment of her mind. There were no frivolities, no decorations meant to impress a visitor, for there would be no visitors. The air was still and scentless, devoid of perfume or the lingering aroma of grand dinners, carrying only the faint, clean smell of old paper and beeswax. How does a person redesign their world to exclude all others? She became the architect of her own isolation, transforming a home built for spectacle into a machine for living alone. The mansion's skeleton remained the same, but its soul had been utterly inverted. The ballroom directly below her quiet study stood frozen in time, its polished floor reflecting nothing, its chandeliers shrouded in dust cloths like sleeping ghosts. Her environment was no longer a backdrop for a life. It was the life itself, a perfect and silent echo of her innermost self. The world beyond the painted glass existed only as a muffled echo, a distant hum of carriages and conversation that never breached the sanctity of her floor. Yet she was not entirely alone in her self-made fortress. A handful of souls formed a human bridge between her hidden kingdom and the outside world, a small, fiercely loyal coterie of servants who became the sole witnesses to her new existence. They were the gatekeepers, the silent partners in her seclusion, bound to her not just by employment, but by a profound, unspoken understanding. The most senior was her housekeeper, a woman of immense discretion who had known her since childhood. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, turning away visitors with a polite but firm finality that brooked no argument. She was the one who intercepted the last desperate attempts at correspondence, who ensured the pantry was stocked with the simple foods her mistress preferred, and who supervised the small staff with a watchful eye for any sign of gossip. Then there was her personal maid, the only person permitted to help her dress and attend to her few remaining needs. Their interactions were conducted in near silence, a ritual of simple gestures and understood preferences. The maid would lay out a plain, dark dress each morning, brush her long hair, and then retreat, her work done. There was no discussion of fashion, no news from the city, only the quiet maintenance of a body that had renounced its role as a public spectacle. These women, and perhaps one or two others like a trusted cook or a groundskeeper, formed the entirety of her human contact. What did they see in those quiet rooms? They saw a woman who was not the hysterical invalid of public speculation, but a person of intense and focused calm. They saw her reading for hours, writing in her journals, or simply sitting in peaceful contemplation. They were the guardians of her truth, knowing that the reality of her life, a life of chosen peace and intellectual pursuit, was far less scandalous and yet far more incomprehensible to the world than any rumor of madness. The pressure on them was immense. They were offered bribes by reporters, questioned anxiously by concerned or merely curious family friends, and lived with the constant knowledge that a single careless word could shatter the sanctuary they helped maintain. Their loyalty became a testament to the person she was behind the legend, suggesting a character so compelling in its quiet integrity that it commanded absolute devotion. They protected not a prisoner, but a sovereign who had willingly abdicated her throne, and in doing so, they became the silent custodians of one of history's most profound and private rebellions. In the absence of facts, the public imagination rushed to fill the void with spectacular fiction. The woman who had vanished became a blank canvas, and upon it, society painted its wildest fears and most tantalizing fantasies. The polite whispers about a nervous condition quickly gave way to far more dramatic theories. One persistent rumor claimed a terrible accident had left her face horribly disfigured, that the legendary beauty now hid a monstrous visage behind the painted windows. Another popular story insisted she had lost her mind entirely, that she roamed the cavernous, darkened halls of her mansion, dressed in the tattered remains of her old ball gowns, holding one-sided conversations with the ghosts of her past. For those who could not fathom a voluntary retreat from such immense wealth, a more sinister narrative took hold. She was, they whispered, a miser of epic proportions, hoarding her fortune in a vast pile of gold coins in a sealed room, counting and recounting her wealth like a dragon guarding its treasure. Others speculated she was conducting bizarre scientific experiments or had become consumed by occult practices, turning her home into a laboratory for the unnatural. These legends were not confined to hushed drawing room conversations. They became the stuff of popular newspaper features and even fictionalized accounts in novels. The public, which had once adored her image, now voraciously consumed these grotesque caricatures. It was easier to believe in a tragic monster or a mad woman than to accept the simple, quiet truth that a person could consciously choose to reject everything the world valued. Her silence was a riddle, and the world could only offer answers that fit within the boundaries of its own understanding, answers rooted in tragedy, madness, or sin. The real mystery, the one no rumor could capture, was what profound peace or profound disillusionment could possibly be powerful enough to make a gilded cage, once inhabited, feel more like a prison than a palace. Her fortress of solitude became the ultimate prize for a new breed of journalist. The very papers that had once celebrated her every public move now dedicated columns to her complete disappearance, dubbing her the ghost of Fifth Avenue. This tantalizing title fueled a public obsession, and reporters were dispatched to break the story. They set up unofficial stakeouts across the street, their notebooks ready, their cameras loaded with flash powder, hoping to document the moment the legendary beauty finally emerged. They tried every trick in the book. Young, fresh-faced reporters would approach the servants' entrance, posing as delivery boys with fictional floral arrangements, their eyes scanning the dim hallway for any sign of her. Others attempted to bribe the groundskeeper for a glimpse into the walled garden, speculating she might take the air there at dawn. The most brazen even attempted to scale the rear garden wall under cover of darkness, only to be firmly escorted off the property by a watchman. The pressure was relentless, a low-grade siege against her peace. Can you picture the scene? A woman sitting in her painted room, reading in perfect silence, while just beyond the brick and mortar, a small army of men waited for her to make a single mistake, to show her face at a window, to step outside for just one moment. The value of a single photograph of the vanished heiress would have been astronomical, a fortune paid for a glimpse of a ghost. This constant, invasive attention meant that her seclusion was not a passive state, but an active, daily defense. Every drawn curtain, every refused entry, every loyal servant turning away a stranger was a deliberate act in a silent war against a world that refused to let her go. Her greatest challenge was not the solitude itself, but the immense effort required to maintain it against the relentless curiosity of the public she had left behind. For her family, her seclusion was a slow-burning social catastrophe. They were pillars of a world built on visibility and ritual, and the permanent disappearance of their most celebrated member was an unending source of whispered speculation and polite, cutting inquiries. How does a dynasty explain that its crown jewel has voluntarily locked herself away? Publicly, they maintained a united front of dignified concern. They spoke of a profound and lasting grief, of a delicate constitution that required absolute rest and quiet, hoping these Victorian-era euphemisms would satisfy the gossip and allow the spotlight to shift. Privately, their feelings were a turbulent mix of confusion, frustration, and profound embarrassment. This was not the future they had meticulously planned and invested in for generations. Their daughter, the human instrument of their ultimate social ascension, had not just failed to perform her role, she had set the entire script on fire. The pressure to coax her back, or at least to manufacture a plausible excuse for her absence, must have been immense, a constant, humiliating undertow in their own glittering lives. Legally, her situation created a labyrinth of complications. She was an heiress of full age, in possession of a staggering fortune that was legally and irrevocably hers. This was not a case where a family could easily declare her incompetent and seize control of her assets, not without ironclad proof of insanity, which her calm, deliberate choice to live in seclusion certainly was not. The very clarity of her mind, her ability to manage her own affairs through written instructions to her lawyers and staff, became a shield. Her family was trapped in a bizarre limbo. They were the stewards of a vast empire, yet they had no practical control over one of its largest individual shares. a fortune that was physically present in their own home, yet entirely inaccessible. They had to navigate business decisions and financial strategies while essentially working around a silent, absent partner. This legal autonomy was her ultimate power, the final barrier that prevented them from forcing her back into the world. She was not a prisoner in her room, she was its sovereign. The social explanations they offered became increasingly threadbare over the years. A temporary grief could not explain a decade of absence. A nervous condition began to sound like a permanent and therefore shameful affliction. They were caught in a web of their own making, forced to uphold the very social conventions that their daughter's life now openly mocked. Every time they attended a ball or hosted a dinner in the opulent rooms below her silent floor, they were implicitly answering the question nobody dared ask aloud. Yes, she is still here. No, you cannot see her. The family itself became a spectacle, a living reminder of the mystery. Were they her jailers or were they her captives? Their greatest fear was likely not for her health, but for their own legacy. The story of the vanishing heiress was a stain on their name, a bizarre footnote that threatened to overshadow all their achievements and power. In trying to protect her, or perhaps to protect themselves, they became the reluctant guardians of a secret they never wanted to keep, living in the shadow of a ghost who was inconveniently still very much alive. Her profound silence was eventually broken by the clamor of a courtroom. The legal battles began not during her lifetime, but in the echoing void she left behind, a final, posthumous conflict over the fortune she had so carefully guarded. Her last will and testament was a document of breathtaking defiance, a final articulation of the principles she had lived by for decades. The vast majority of her estate, that colossal railroad fortune, was not bequeathed to the society cousins or the distant relatives who had long anticipated a windfall. Instead, she left it to a handful of charities and institutions dedicated to animal welfare, the quiet preservation of natural lands, and the support of public libraries. It was a will written by the woman she had become, the solitary reader and nature lover, and it completely disinherited the glittering world of her birth. The reaction was immediate and furious. A coalition of spurned relatives, some of whom she had never even met, launched a ferocious legal challenge. Their argument was rooted in the very seclusion that had defined her. They petitioned the courts to have her declared mentally incompetent at the time the will was written, claiming that decades of isolation were clear evidence of an unsound mind. They argued that no rational person would willingly cut themselves off from their own family and society, and that such a life choice was, in itself, proof of insanity. The trial that followed was a grotesque inversion of her life. The very solitude she had cultivated as a sanctuary was now presented as the central exhibit against her character and her sanity. Her loyal servants were subpoenaed and forced to testify about the details of her private life. Her painted windows and simple meals held up as evidence of a broken psyche. The relatives' lawyers painted a picture of a lonely, eccentric recluse, manipulated in her isolation by cunning outsiders, namely the charities named in the will. It was a brutal invasion, the final, ugly assault on the peace she had fought so hard to build. The court, however, saw through the desperate greed. After hearing all the evidence, the judge upheld her will in its entirety. The ruling was a powerful vindication, a legal affirmation that a person's choice to live differently, even radically differently, did not negate their soundness of mind or their right to dispose of their property as they saw fit. Her victory from beyond the grave cemented her legacy not as a madwoman, but as a woman of immense and unshakable conviction. The fortune that had once been a tool for social climbing was transformed by her final wish into a permanent force for the quiet, compassionate causes she truly valued. The city's fascination with her ghost story made any small detail a precious commodity. On a bitterly cold morning in February, a young coal delivery man, his face smudged and hands blackened, was directed to a basement chute at the side of the mansion. The housekeeper had given strict instructions, but a miscalculation or a forgotten key forced him to ring a service bell he was meant to avoid. After a long moment, a side door cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of the dim interior. And there she stood. The delivery man would later swear to his family that he had seen the famous beauty, but the woman he described bore little resemblance to the society portrait he had once seen in a shop window. She was dressed in a simple, high-necked dress of dark gray wool, unadorned and severe. Her famous hair, once piled high in elaborate coiffures, was pulled back into a plain, loose knot, its color faded. But it was her eyes that struck him most, he said. They were not wild or frantic, as the rumors of madness suggested, but profoundly calm and clear, like the still surface of a deep lake. She did not speak, only looked at him with a quiet, questioning gaze until the flustered housekeeper rushed in, shooing him away with frantic apologies. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 seconds, but the story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. She was not a disfigured monster, but a woman of startling composure, a living presence of such intense quietude that it felt more unnerving than any specter. Years later, a carpenter hired to repair a rotting windowsill on the garden side of the house had a similar, fleeting encounter. He was perched on his ladder, carefully prying away the damaged wood, when a movement in an upstairs window caught his eye. The painted pane on the lower half blocked a direct view, but the upper, clear portion reflected the room's interior for a single, brilliant moment. He saw her standing by a bookshelf, one hand resting on the spine of a large volume, her head tilted as if in thought. She was perfectly still, bathed in the soft, north-facing light. He described the room as shockingly simple, almost monk-like, with walls of books and no fine furniture or decorations in sight. Then, as if sensing his intrusive gaze, she turned her head slightly. She did not startle or rush to close the curtain. She simply stepped back, moving with a slow, deliberate grace out of the frame of the reflection, vanishing as silently as she had appeared. The carpenter, a pragmatic man not given to fancy, found himself deeply unsettled. He had expected to see signs of decay or chaos, but what he witnessed was a scene of such purposeful peace that it defied all the popular legends. These rare, accidental sightings never provided the satisfaction the public craved. They confirmed only one thing, that she was alive and physically well, but they deepened the central mystery exponentially. The truth they revealed was far more baffling than any fiction. The ghost of Fifth Avenue was not a madwoman, but a woman of serene and resolute will, a sovereign in her silent kingdom, and that was a reality the outside world simply could not process. Her deliberate isolation forces us to ask what psychological forces could compel such a radical departure. From a modern perspective, we might diagnose a constellation of conditions. Severe social anxiety could have made every ballroom feel like a tribunal, the gaze of the crowd a source of paralyzing dread. Agoraphobia, a fear of places that might cause panic or helplessness, could explain why the world beyond her painted windows became a landscape of terror. A profound depression, perhaps triggered by her brother's death, might have drained the color and meaning from her former life, leaving only a hollow exhaustion where ambition once thrived. Yet to label her with a single disorder is to oversimplify a deeply human response to an inhuman pressure. Her world was a psychological pressure cooker. From childhood, her identity was not her own. It was a commodity to be polished and sold for a dynastic advantage. Every smile was a performance, every friendship a strategic alliance, and every potential suitor a business proposition. This constant state of being watched, judged, and valued only for her utility is a form of chronic psychological stress that can fracture the sturdiest of personalities. Her retreat was not a sudden breakdown, but a strategic withdrawal from a hostile environment. Think of it as a profound and final act of setting a boundary. The gilded cage was not just a metaphor, it was her reality, and her seclusion was the only way she could, finally, unequivocally, lock the door from the inside. Her actions were not necessarily a symptom of madness, but a rational response to a world that had systematically denied her any authentic self. She chose the peace of 4 quiet walls over the torture of 1,000 glittering ones, trading the prison of public adoration for the sanctuary of a private kingdom. The painted windows did not look in on an empty room, but a studio of the mind. Her seclusion was not a void, but a vessel for a different kind of creation, one that required no audience and sought no applause. While the world speculated about madness, she was likely engaged in the most disciplined of arts, the art of thought itself. Her medium was not oil, paint, or musical notes, but words and ideas, meticulously recorded in the journals and letters that were her primary occupation. Imagine the stacks of leather-bound volumes filling her shelves, each page a quiet conversation with herself, a processing of a lifetime of observation. This was not the frantic scribbling of a disturbed mind, but the deliberate work of an intellectual, refining her philosophy in the one place she could truly be free. She had traded the ballroom for the library, the performance for the page. Her creative output was her own reconstructed self, a person built not on the expectations of others, but on the foundation of her own quiet curiosity. What greater work of art is there than a life lived entirely on one's own terms? The silence she cultivated was not barren. It was fertile ground for a profound internal life to finally flourish. Without the constant demand to be a symbol, she could simply be a sentient, thinking human, and that was the most radical creative act of all. While she read by the same steady light in her painted room, the 20th century accelerated into a roaring, chaotic new era just beyond her walls. The First World War reshaped the global order, but the sounds of victory parades and the grief of lost sons were just distant murmurs to her. Then came the 1920s, the Jazz Age, a seismic cultural shift that made her Gilded Age world seem as ancient as the pyramids. The rigid social codes she had been bred to uphold were shattered. Young women, now called flappers, bobbed their hair, smoked in public, and danced to wild, syncopated music in crowded speakeasies. The corseted, formal world of her debut was now a relic, a subject of nostalgic curiosity. The very mansion she inhabited became an anachronism, a grand fossil on a street now filled with the blaring horns of motor cars instead of the gentle clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages. Her seclusion, once a scandal, became a kind of living archaeology. She was a preserved specimen of a vanished era, existing in a bubble of 19th century silence while the 20th century roared past her windows. How surreal it must have been to be so physically present in the heart of a modern city, yet entirely disconnected from its rhythm and soul. The world outside was hurtling forward, but within her sanctuary, time had simply stopped. Then the roar of the 20s collapsed into the silence of the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 wiped out fortunes far less secure than her own protected trust, and the mood of the nation shifted from exuberance to despair. Red lines formed on streets just blocks away from her mansion. The plight of the common man became the defining story of a generation, a narrative of shared hardship that stood in stark contrast to her life of chosen, solitary privilege. While millions struggled for basic survival, she continued her quiet routine, her wealth insulating her from the economic catastrophe that consumed the country. Her isolation was no longer just a personal eccentricity. It was a historical paradox. She was a living monument to an age of extreme wealth, standing immovable while the society that created that wealth crumbled around her. The pressure outside her doors was no longer about social curiosity, but about raw human need, yet her gates remained just as firmly locked. Later still, the drums of war began to beat again. The Second World War mobilized the entire nation. Rationing, blackout drills, and waves of young men in uniform transformed the city once more. The collective purpose and shared sacrifice of the war years created a new kind of American identity, one defined by community and action. And still, she remained in her book-lined room, a silent, static figure in a world defined by violent, unstoppable change. Her life became a study in contrasts. The personal peace she had fought so hard to secure existed in a century defined by global conflict. The fortune she guarded had been built by the industrial expansion that now fueled a world at war. She had escaped the gilded cage of her youth, only to find herself suspended in a different kind of prison, the prison of time itself, a permanent resident of a past that the world had hurriedly and violently left behind. The end came as quietly as her life had been for decades. She died alone in her room, sometime in the middle of a February night in 1937. The cause was listed simply as heart failure, a final, natural closing of a life that had long since turned inward. She was 84 years old. The discovery was made by her housekeeper the next morning, a grim routine of bringing a breakfast tray that turned into the moment the outside world had been waiting for. The police were called, and for the first time in nearly half a century, strangers walked freely through the sealed upper floors of the mansion. What they found was not the chaotic horde of a madwoman, but the meticulously ordered cell of an ascetic. The air was still and carried the faint, clean scent of old books and beeswax. The room where she died was Spartan, dominated by a simple iron bedstead and walls of bookshelves that reached the ceiling. On a small table beside her bed lay a single, leather-bound journal and a pair of reading glasses. The most striking detail, the one that spoke volumes about the completeness of her retreat, was the stack of newspapers found neatly tied with string in a corner. They were not from the previous week or month, but were decades old, their headlines shouting about events in a world that had ceased to exist for her long ago. There was no evidence of a radio, no connection to the roaring modern city that had grown up around her fortress. A formal inventory of her home revealed the full extent of her chosen reality. Downstairs, the grand parlors and ballroom were exactly as they had been in the 1880s, shrouded in dust cloths, their gilded furniture and crystal chandeliers frozen in time. But the private rooms she actually inhabited told a different story. Her wardrobe contained only a few simple, dark dresses, meticulously maintained but decades out of fashion. Her kitchen stores were minimal, stocked with plain tea, crackers, and simple soups. There were no personal luxuries, no jewels, no fine perfumes. Every object served a practical purpose or nourished her mind, a stark contrast to the legendary opulence she had rejected. The public reaction to her death was a strange mixture of morbid fascination and a faint, lingering respect. Obituaries struggled to reconcile the dazzling beauty of her youth with the enigmatic recluse of her old age. The legend of the ghost of Fifth Avenue was finally, definitively confirmed, yet the reality of her peaceful end and orderly surroundings dismantled the wilder rumors of disfigurement and madness. She had not been a monster in the attic, but a woman of immense and unyielding will. Her death did not solve the mystery of her life, it only deepened it. How could a human being sustain such absolute solitude, not as a temporary grief, but as a lifelong conviction? The quiet closing of her bedroom door was the final act in a play she had written, directed, and starred in for over 50 years. A silent masterpiece of defiance that left the noisy world outside with nothing but questions. Her final words were not spoken, but written in a legal document that would detonate one last scandal. The last will and testament of the woman known as the Ghost of Fifth Avenue was a masterpiece of posthumous defiance, a document that meticulously dismantled the dynastic expectations she had rejected in life. When her lawyers gathered the named beneficiaries and the excluded relatives in a somber office, the air grew thick with disbelief. The vast railroad fortune, a sum that could have propped up a small nation, was not passed down the family tree. Instead, she bequeathed the overwhelming bulk of her wealth to a carefully selected group of charities dedicated to animal welfare, the preservation of natural landscapes, and the quiet support of public libraries. It was the ultimate articulation of her true self, a final, magnificent gift to the causes of the solitary reader and the silent walker she had always been. The spurned relatives, a collection of distant cousins and society connections who had long awaited their windfall, listened in stunned silence. Their shock quickly curdled into outrage. How could she? The legal challenge was launched almost before the ink on the probate documents was dry. A coalition of these relatives petitioned the court to have the will declared invalid, arguing that decades of self-imposed isolation were irrefutable proof of an unsound mind. They painted a picture of a lonely, manipulated eccentric, a woman whose judgment had been warped by her bizarre lifestyle and the cunning influence of charity lawyers. The ensuing trial was a brutal public vivisection of the private peace she had so carefully built. Her loyal servants were forced to take the stand, their quiet devotion scrutinized, and their descriptions of her simple, ordered life twisted into evidence of insanity. The painted windows, the plain meals, the lack of a radio, all were presented as symptoms of a profound mental break. The relatives' attorneys argued that no sane person would willingly cut themselves off from their family and the world, that such a choice was in itself a form of madness. It was the final, ugly invasion, a desperate attempt to pathologize a profound personal choice, simply because it defied all social and financial logic. The courtroom became a theater where the gilded world she had left behind tried to reclaim its property by destroying her character. Yet the judge saw through the greed-fueled performance. After weighing all the evidence, the court delivered a stunning vindication, upholding her will in its entirety. The ruling was a powerful legal affirmation that a person's soundness of mind is not determined by their conformity to social norms. Her choice for solitude, however radical, was just that, a choice, and it did not negate her right to dispose of her legacy according to her own deeply held values. The fortune that had once been a tool for social climbing was now permanently transformed into an endowment for quiet compassion, a final, unassailable victory for the woman who had chosen to live by her own rules. Her story did not end with the closing of the probate case, but transformed into a potent cultural myth, a mirror reflecting our own changing anxieties and aspirations. Today, she is remembered not as one single figure, but as three distinct archetypes, each one revealing a different facet of our collective imagination. To some, she is the ultimate tragic figure, a woman so broken by personal loss and societal pressure that she retreated into a living death. In this version, her gilded cage was inescapable, and her seclusion is a somber lesson on the destructive power of expectation. To others, she is a pioneering symbol of rebellion, a woman who, in an era of suffocating conformity, made the ultimate statement of independence by walking away from it all. Her painted windows become not a sign of madness, but a banner of defiance against a world that valued women for their appearance and utility above all else. And to a third group, she remains a bizarre historical footnote, an eccentric curiosity whose extreme choices are so far removed from modern life that they inspire more bafflement than empathy. This very ambiguity is what gives her story its enduring power. It asks us a deeply personal question, one without an easy answer. Was she a victim of her world, or its only victor? Her life resists a simple verdict, forcing us to confront our own definitions of freedom, sanity, and a life well lived. This compelling mystery has made her a ghost that haunts our fiction. She is the unseen inspiration for reclusive heiresses in countless novels, the spectral ancestor of characters who vanish from high society, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. In film, her essence permeates stories of glamorous figures who choose to disappear, their luxurious isolation a dramatic backdrop for exploring themes of identity and escape. She has become a cultural shorthand for the ultimate rejection of materialism and the high price of nonconformity. Her legacy is not a statue or a foundation bearing her name, but something far more pervasive, a story that continues to be told and retold, because we are still trying to understand the woman who dared to answer the world's adoration with 50 years of absolute, unbroken silence. Her incredible journey from ballroom belle to legendary hermit traces the arc of a soul pushed to its absolute limit. She possessed everything her world said a person should want: staggering wealth, breathtaking beauty, and the adoration of an entire society. Yet she found it all to be an empty, glittering shell. The very things that defined her in the public eye became the chains she had to break. Her story is not just a historical curiosity. It is a profound meditation on the cost of conformity and the radical lengths one might go to reclaim their own spirit. We are left to wonder about the hidden toll of a life lived under a microscope, where every smile is a performance and every choice is a transaction. What secrets was she carrying behind those famous eyes during her most triumphant nights? The weight of her family's ambitions, the constant scrutiny of the press, the knowledge that her heart was the least important factor in her own future. These were the ghosts that followed her into the ballroom. Her ultimate escape into silence was not a surrender, but a strategic retreat, a final, powerful act of setting a boundary that the world could not cross. It reminds us that escape can take many forms, some loud and dramatic, others so quiet they become a legend. It asks us to consider what we might be willing to walk away from to find our own version of peace. Was her life a tragedy of unfulfilled potential, or a triumphant declaration of selfhood? The answer may depend entirely on your own definition of freedom. We would love to hear which part of her extraordinary story resonates most deeply with you. Was it the pressure of her gilded cage, the quiet rebellion of her private studies, or the sheer will it took to maintain her solitude for half a century? Share your thoughts in the comments below.